Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Out here in the Pacific Northwest, the map is stitched together with logging roads, forgotten farm towns, and cabins so deep in the woods you can't see another porch light for miles. From the highway, it all looks peaceful. Up close, some of these places feel like they were built to swallow people whole. Tonight's cases all come from those isolated corners. A Spokane homicide detective who can no longer drive past a semi-truck without feeling sick. A desperate job seeker in Portland who answered an ad for farm work and walked into a nightmare of mud and squealing hogs. A Montana cold case involving a basin that locals refused to enter. A police standoff in Blackwood Ridge that revealed secrets buried in the soil. And a junior ranger trapped in an Oregon snowstorm who realized the tracks outside his station didn't belong to any animal. Before the stories start, tell us in the comments where you're listening from and whether you'd still camp alone in these woods after this. Also, YouTube tells me that only about 4% of the people who watch these videos are actually subscribed. If you're in that other 96%, please consider hitting that subscribe button. It's free, it helps more than you think, and it keeps this channel digging up the stories that never should have been buried. Now, turn down the lights and let's head into the trees. Story 1. I was 23 when this happened, back in the winter of 2003. I'd been living in Portland for about a year at that point, trying to make ends meet after dropping out of community college. The whole college thing just wasn't for me, if I'm being honest. I was working part-time at a gas station on Burnside Street, one of those 24-hour places that smelled like stale coffee and cigarette smoke, no matter how many times they mopped the floors. The money wasn't cutting it, though. I was behind on rent, surviving on ramen noodles and the occasional free hot dog from work, and I was honestly just one bad week away from being out on the street completely. I'm not proud of how I was living back then, but desperation makes you do things you wouldn't normally consider. Makes you ignore red flags you'd usually spot from a mile away. I'd started checking the classifieds every single morning, circling anything that looked remotely promising. Day labor, moving jobs, yard work, whatever paid cash, and didn't ask too many questions. That's how I found the ad that changed everything. It was in the back of the Willamette Week, tucked between ads for roommates and used furniture. The print was small and easy to miss, but something about it caught my eye. Farm help needed. Cash paid daily. Light work, no experience necessary. Call for details. There was a phone number at the bottom. No name, no address, just the number. I should have found that strange, but at the time all I could think about was the cash part. I called it that same afternoon. The man who answered had this slow, deliberate way of speaking, like he was choosing each word carefully before letting it out. His voice was deep and gravelly, the kind that came from years of smoking, or maybe just from living alone in the middle of nowhere. He introduced himself as Bernard Kovar. He said he owned a hog farm about 2 hours outside Portland, near a little town called Cedarville. I'd never heard of it, but that didn't surprise me. Oregon has dozens of these tiny, forgotten towns scattered throughout the Cascade foothills. Bernard explained that he needed help sorting through scrap metal and cleaning out some old storage sheds before winter really set in. He said the work wasn't hard, just tedious, and that he'd pay $200 for a full day's work, plus a hot meal. $200. Well, that was more than I made in 3 shifts at the gas station. I didn't even hesitate. I told him I could be there the next morning. He seemed pleased. He gave me detailed directions. Take Highway 26 east toward Mount Hood, then cut north on a series of increasingly smaller back roads until I hit Timber Ridge Road. His farm was at the very end, he said. I couldn't miss it. Something about the way he said that last part stuck with me, but I brushed it off. I borrowed my roommate's car the next morning, a beat-up Honda Civic that barely ran and burned oil like it was going out of style. My roommate was a good guy, though. He didn't ask too many questions when I told him I had a job opportunity. I left Portland just after sunrise. The sky was overcast and gray, typical for December in the Pacific Northwest, and there was a light mist in the air that clung to everything. The drive started out fine. I merged onto Highway 26 and headed east, watching the city slowly disappear in my rearview mirror. The scenery changed quickly once I left the metro area. Portland's industrial sprawl gave way to dense forests of Douglas fir and western hemlock. The morning light, what little there was of it, filtered through the trees in pale shafts. Patches of frost still clung to the roadside grass, even though it was well past sunrise. It was beautiful in that quiet, isolated way that the Pacific Northwest does so well. But the further I drove, the more that isolation started to feel less beautiful and more unsettling. The houses grew sparse, then they disappeared entirely. The road narrowed. I passed a few, logging trucks and an old pickup. But after about 90 minutes, I hadn't seen another vehicle in over 20 miles. When I finally turned onto Timber Ridge Road, I felt this knot form in my stomach. The road wasn't paved. It was just gravel and mud, rutted and uneven, and it wound through the trees for what felt like forever. The Honda's suspension complained with every bump. Branches hung low over the road, scraping against the roof. I passed no other cars, no mailboxes, no signs of life whatsoever. I started to wonder if I'd made a wrong turn. I checked the directions Bernard had given me. They matched. I kept driving. The knot in my stomach tightened. That's when I finally saw it. The farm. It sat at the very end of the road, exactly like Bernard had said. A sprawling property surrounded by sagging wooden fences that looked like they'd been neglected for decades. There were several outbuildings scattered across the property, all of them leaning slightly as if the wind had been trying to push them over for years. Piles of rusted machinery littered the grounds. Old tractor parts, metal barrels, coils of wire, car frames. It looked less like a working farm and more like a junkyard. In the distance, I could see the hog pens. Even from inside the car, with the windows rolled up, I could hear them, dozens of them grunting and squealing and moving around. The sound made my skin crawl for some reason. I parked near the main house, a squat structure with peeling white paint and a sagging porch. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment. Everything in me was screaming that this was a mistake, that I should turn around and leave. But I thought about the $200. I thought about my overdue rent. I got out of the car. The air smelled immediately wrong. It wasn't just the smell of manure, which was strong, but there was something else underneath it. Wood smoke mixed with something sour and rotten. The kind of smell that gets in your nose and stays there. I stood there for a moment looking around trying to get my bearings when a man emerged from one of the larger sheds. He was tall, maybe 6'2" or 6'3", with thinning gray hair that stuck up in odd directions. He wore faded jeans and a heavy flannel jacket. As he got closer, I could see his face more clearly. It looked weathered, lined with deep creases, and his left eye drooped noticeably, giving him this unsettling, lopsided stare. He wiped his hands on his jeans as he approached, and I noticed his fingers were thick and gnarled. "You must be the one I talked to," he said. His voice was the same as it had been on the phone, slow, measured, deliberate. "I'm Bernard." I shook his hand. His grip was firm, almost too firm, and his fingers were rough with calluses. He looked me up and down like he was sizing me up, taking inventory. After a long moment, he nodded toward one of the larger sheds on the far side of the property. "We'll start over there," he said. "Got a lot of old scrap that needs sorting. Metal in one pile, wood in another, tools in a third. Not complicated work, just takes time." He started walking, and I followed. The ground was uneven, muddy in some spots, and frozen solid in others. We passed the hog pens, and I tried not to look too closely at them. The hogs themselves were massive, easily 300 or 400 pounds each, and they pressed against the fencing as we walked by. Bernard didn't seem to notice them or care. He just kept walking with that slow, deliberate gait until we reached the shed. He pushed the door open. It groaned on its hinges. Inside it was dark and freezing cold. Colder somehow than it was outside. There were piles of junk everywhere. Rusted chains hung from hooks on the walls. Broken tools lay scattered across the floor. Rotting wooden planks were stacked in the corners. The smell was worse in here. That same sour, rotten smell I'd noticed earlier, but concentrated. It made my eyes water. Bernard didn't seem bothered by it. He handed me a pair of work gloves, old leather ones that were stiff and cracked. "Get started on that back pile," he said, pointing toward the far corner. "I'll be back in a bit to check on your progress." Then he left. The door creaked shut behind him, and I was alone. I stood there for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light. The only illumination came from the gaps between the wall boards and the open door which Bernard had left slightly ajar. I pulled on the gloves and got to work. The first hour wasn't too bad. The work was exactly what Bernard had described. Tedious, but not difficult. I sorted through piles of scrap metal, separating steel from aluminum, pulling out anything that looked like it might be a usable tool. My hands were numb despite the gloves, and my breath came out in visible puffs. I kept glancing toward the door, half expecting Bernard to return, but he didn't. The only sounds were the wind outside and the distant squealing of the hogs. The longer I worked, though, the more uneasy I felt. The shed had no windows, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time the wind blew, the door would creak, and I'd jump thinking someone was standing there. I tried to focus on the work, to think about the $200, but my mind kept wandering to how isolated I was out here, how no one knew where I was, how my roommate probably wouldn't even notice I was missing until I didn't come home that night. That's when I noticed the stains. They were on the concrete floor, near the very back of the shed, in the darkest corner where the light barely reached. At first, I thought they were just oil stains or maybe old paint, but the more I looked at them, the more wrong they seemed. They were dark, brownish red, and they spread out in these irregular patterns, like something had been dragged across the floor. Some of them looked scrubbed, lighter than the others, like someone had tried to clean them up, but hadn't quite managed to erase them completely. My stomach turned. I told myself I was being paranoid. Farms are messy places. Blood from butchered animals isn't uncommon. But something about these stains felt different. I moved closer, crouching down to get a better look. That's when I saw the metal ring. It was bolted directly into the concrete floor, thick and solid, the kind of thing you'd use to secure heavy equipment, or chain something down, or someone. I stood up quickly, my heart suddenly pounding. That's when Bernard appeared in the doorway. I literally jumped. I hadn't heard him approach. He just materialized there, blocking most of the light. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there staring at me with that lopsided gaze. Then slowly, like it was being pulled by strings, a smile spread across his face. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, that looks more like a grimace. "Find something interesting?" he asked. His voice was different now. Flatter, less careful. I shook my head quickly, forcing myself to stay calm. No, I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. Just cold. Thought I'd take a break for a second. He stared at me for what felt like a full minute. Then he nodded slowly. Why don't you come up to the house, he said. I'll make us some coffee. Warm you up. You've been working hard. Everything in me screamed not to follow him. Every instinct I had was telling me to run, to get in the car and leave. But I didn't know what else to do. If I ran, he'd know something was wrong. If I refused, he'd know I was scared. And scared people are unpredictable. I didn't want to be unpredictable. So I followed him. I walked across the property toward the main house, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I kept my hands in my pockets so he wouldn't see them shaking. The inside of the house was worse than I expected. It was cluttered and dim, with heavy curtains drawn over the windows. The walls were lined with shelves crammed with jars, some of them filled with screws and nails, others containing things I couldn't identify in the low light. Stacks of old newspapers leaned in the corners. Tools hung from hooks. There was a wood stove in the corner, radiating heat, and the air smelled like burnt coffee and something faintly metallic. Bernard gestured toward a chair at the kitchen table. I sat down because I didn't know what else to do. He moved slowly around the kitchen, pulling down 2 mugs from a cabinet, and pouring coffee from a pot that looked like it had been sitting on the stove for hours. He set one of the mugs in front of me. The coffee was thick and black, and I didn't touch it. I just wrapped my hands around the mug, pretending to warm them. Bernard sat down across from me. He didn't drink his coffee either. He just watched me. You seem nervous, he said. I'm fine, I lied. He leaned back in his chair. It creaked under his weight. You know, he said, most people don't last long out here. Too quiet for them, too isolated. They get spooked. He paused, studying my face. You seem like you could handle it, though. You seem like someone who knows how to keep to themselves. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. He kept talking, his voice taking on this almost conversational tone. He told me about the farm, how his family had owned it for 3 generations, how his father had built most of the outbuildings by hand, how he'd been running the place alone since the old man died back in '88. But the whole time he was talking, I wasn't really listening. I was looking for exits, planning routes, trying to figure out how quickly I could get to the door. That's when I noticed it. On the counter behind him, just sitting there next to a stack of mail and a dirty dish, a driver's license. I could only see it from the side, but I could tell it wasn't his. The photo showed a young woman, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair pulled back. I couldn't read the name from where I was sitting, but I didn't need to. The way it was just sitting there casually, like it was nothing, like it was a trophy or a souvenir, made my blood run cold. Bernard must have noticed me staring because he stopped talking mid-sentence. He turned slowly to look at what I was seeing. Then he turned back to me. The conversational tone was gone. So was the smile. His expression was flat now, empty. I think it's time for you to get back to work, he said quietly. I stood up too quickly. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. Actually, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, I just remembered I have to be somewhere. Family thing. I should probably head out. His expression didn't change. You haven't finished the job. I know, I said. I'm sorry. But something came up. Emergency. He stood up slowly. He was even taller than I'd realized. The way he moved was deliberate, controlled, like a predator deciding whether or not to strike. That's a shame, he said. I was hoping you'd stay for dinner. I don't get much company out here. I didn't wait for him to say anything else. I turned and walked toward the door, moving as quickly as I could without running. He didn't try to stop me, but I could feel him watching me. I could feel his eyes on my back. I stepped outside, and the cold air hit me like a physical blow. My lungs burned. I started walking toward the car, faster now, my hands fumbling in my pockets for the keys. That's when I heard the shed door slam. It was loud, violent, echoing across the property. I looked up and saw Bernard standing on the porch. He wasn't running, but he was moving now, walking deliberately toward me. I broke into a run. I reached the car and jammed the key into the lock. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get it in. I yanked the door open and threw myself inside. I jammed the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine sputtered, coughed, died. No, 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 I whispered. I turned it again. Nothing. The engine wouldn't catch. I was panicking now. I could see Bernard getting closer. He was maybe 50 feet away, 40. I pumped the gas pedal and tried the ignition one more time. The engine turned over, sputtered, and then finally roared to life. I didn't wait. I threw the car into reverse and floored it. The tires spun in the mud for a second before catching. I didn't look back until I was halfway down Timber Ridge Road. When I finally did, I saw him standing in the middle of the driveway. Just standing there, watching me disappear. He wasn't chasing me. He didn't need to. He knew I'd already seen too much. I didn't stop driving until I hit the highway. My hands were still shaking. My heart was racing so fast I thought I might pass out. I pulled over at a rest stop somewhere outside Sandy and sat there for a long time trying to catch my breath, trying to process what had just happened. I thought about calling the police. I sat there with my phone in my hand, staring at the screen. But what would I tell them? That I saw some stains? That there was a driver's license on a counter? That a guy made me uncomfortable? I had no proof of anything, no evidence, just a feeling, a bad feeling. I convinced myself I was overreacting, that maybe I'd misread the situation, that maybe the license belonged to a relative or a friend, that maybe the stains were just oil or rust or animal blood like I'd originally thought. But deep down I knew I hadn't misread anything. I knew exactly what I'd seen. I just didn't want to believe it. I drove back to Portland, and I didn't tell anyone what happened. Not my roommate, not my friends, no one. I convinced myself it was better that way, that if I just forgot about it, I could move on. I quit the gas station a week later and found a different job. I stopped checking the classifieds. I tried to put the whole thing out of my mind. Years passed. I moved on with my life, got a better job, got my own place, met someone. The memory of that day faded into the background like an old scar you forget about until something makes you look at it again. And then one night in 2008, I was watching the late news and I saw his face. Bernard Cover. The same drooping eye, the same weathered face, the same flat expression. They'd arrested him. The reporter said he was being charged with 18 counts of murder. 18. The police had found remains on his property, in the hog pens, in a hidden cellar beneath one of the sheds, the same shed I'd been working in. DNA evidence linked him to dozens of missing women from Portland, most of them from the same area where I used to work. Women who'd disappeared over the span of almost 2 decades. I sat there staring at the television screen, unable to move. They showed aerial footage of the farm. I recognized it immediately. The same sagging fences, the same outbuildings, the same long, isolated driveway. The detective they interviewed said Bernard had been targeting vulnerable women for years. Women who wouldn't be missed right away, women who were desperate enough to answer ads for cash work in remote locations. Women like me. I should have called them. I should have called the police that day. Maybe if I had, they would have caught him sooner. Maybe some of those women would still be alive. I think about that a lot. I think about the driver's license on the counter. I think about whose it was. I think about her and what must have happened to her. The news said he'd kept trophies, that he'd held his victims in that cellar for days sometimes. I think about how close I came, about what would have happened if my car hadn't started, about the fact that there's no good reason I survived and she didn't. It was just luck, dumb, blind luck. Bernard died in prison in 2012. Another inmate stabbed him. The news barely covered it. Just a small article in the back of the paper. I felt nothing when I read it. No satisfaction, no relief, just this hollow emptiness. He was gone, but the women he killed were still gone too. And I still have to live with the fact that I knew, that I saw, that I ran and I never looked back. I tell myself there's nothing I could have done, that I would have just been another victim, that survival isn't something to feel guilty about. But I do feel guilty, every single day, and I think I always will. Story 2. I retired from the Montana State Police 6 years ago, but there's one case I still think about every single day. It happened in August of 1989 in a place called the Iron Root Basin, just outside a tiny town called White Pine. Population maybe 200 on a good day. Most people have never heard of it, and that's probably for the best. I was a detective sergeant back then, 38 years old, and I'd seen plenty of missing persons cases over the years. Runaways mostly. Occasionally a hiker who'd gotten turned around and wandered off trail. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I found at that campsite. The Sterling family was supposed to check out on August 17th. They'd rented a spot at one of those primitive campsites deep in the national forest, the kind that's more of a clearing with a fire ring than an actual campground. No running water, no electricity, no cell service, just you and the trees and whatever you brought with you. When they didn't show up to return their rental equipment at the outfitter's shop in town, the owner waited a day, figuring they'd just lost track of time. It happens more often than you'd think. People get out there away from clocks and schedules, and they forget what day it is, but when they still hadn't shown up by the 19th, he called it in. I got the assignment on the 20th, 3 days late. That's not great, but it's not panic time either. People lose track of time in the woods. Batteries die, plans change. Cars break down on those rough forest roads. I figured they'd gotten stuck somewhere, or maybe one of the kids had twisted an ankle, and they had to take it slow coming back. I packed my gear, called my partner, and told him we were going for a drive. My partner at the time was a younger guy named Mitch Brennan. He was maybe 26 or 27, fresh out of the academy, with that eager energy young cops have before the job beats it out of them. Good kid, though. Solid instincts. The road into Iron Root Basin was rough as hell. Took us almost 2 hours just to get to the trailhead. We're talking dirt roads full of potholes and rocks that scraped the undercarriage of our cruiser. I remember thinking, if the Sterlings had driven a sedan instead of a station wagon, they might have gotten stuck before they even reached the campsite. From the trailhead, it was another mile on foot. We hauled our gear, radios, first aid kit, evidence collection supplies, extra water, and headed in. The trail wasn't maintained. It was just a path worn down by years of foot traffic winding through thick Douglas fir and western hemlock. The trees were massive, some of them probably 100 feet tall and so dense in spots you couldn't see 10 feet into the brush. It was late afternoon when we arrived, and the light was already starting to fade. The forest has a way of swallowing sunlight, especially when you're deep in like we were. The campsite sat in a small clearing, maybe 30 yards across. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. I know that sounds stupid. It's the woods, of course it's quiet. But this was different. There were no birds, no squirrels chattering, no rustling in the underbrush. Just this heavy, oppressive silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It felt wrong, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Mitch felt it too. I could see it in the way he kept looking over his shoulder, his hand resting on his service weapon. Their car was still there. A tan station wagon with wood paneling parked at the edge of the site, right where you'd leave it if you were planning to come back. I walked over and checked the doors, unlocked. The keys were in the ignition. I tried to start it, but the battery was completely dead. When I turned the key, nothing happened. I checked the radio. The dial was turned all the way to the right, maxed out. If the battery had still been working, it would have been blasting static. That struck me as odd, but not necessarily alarming. Maybe one of the kids had been messing with it. Kids do weird things. Then I saw the table. There was a folding picnic table set up near the fire ring, one of those aluminum ones you can buy at any camping store. 4 bowls of chili were sitting on top. I walked closer. The smell hit me first, sour and rotten. The food had gone bad. There was mold growing on the surface, thick and fuzzy. But the spoons were still in the bowls, like they'd all been eating, mid-bite even, and then just stood up and walked away. No overturned chairs, no spilled bowls, no sign of panic or struggle. They just left. All 4 of them at once. I called out, "Hello? Sterling family? This is the Montana State Police." My voice echoed back at me. Nothing. Just that same heavy silence. Mitch started walking the perimeter of the camp, checking the tent. It was still standing, a blue dome tent big enough for 4 people. The flaps were zipped shut. He opened them and looked inside. Their sleeping bags were laid out neatly. Clothes were folded in the corner. A little girl's stuffed rabbit was sitting on one of the sleeping bags, its button eyes staring up at nothing. Everything looked normal. Too normal. Like they'd stepped out for a walk and planned to come right back. I found the father's wallet on the same table, as the bowls tucked under one of the bowls, like he'd set it there to keep it from blowing away in the wind. I opened it. $400 in cash, still inside, along with his driver's license and 2 credit cards. His name was Elias Sterling, 34 years old. The photo on his license showed a man with a thick beard and kind eyes, the kind of guy you'd trust to help you change a tire on the side of the road. According to the outfitter's records, his wife Mara was 31, a school teacher from a town about 80 miles south. They had 2 kids. Caleb was 7 and Rose was 4. The thing that really got me, though, was the dog. The outfitter had mentioned they'd brought a golden retriever with them. His name was Buster. I found his leash tied to a tree near the tent, or what was left of it anyway. The leash had been cut, not chewed through, not snapped from pulling too hard. Cut. Sliced clean through with something incredibly sharp. The edge was so smooth it looked almost surgical, like someone had used a razor blade or a very sharp knife. That sent a chill down my spine. Dogs don't cut their own leashes, and if the family had needed to free the dog quickly, they would have just unclipped the leash from his collar. That's when I knew something was very, very wrong. You don't leave $400 in cash sitting on a table. You don't leave your car keys in the ignition. You don't leave your food half-eaten unless something forces you to. And you sure as hell don't cut your dog's leash unless you're in a terrible hurry, or unless someone else is doing it for you. I looked at Mitch. He was staring at the leash too, his face pale. We called in a search and rescue team that night. By morning, we had 40 volunteers combing the area. Park rangers, local volunteers, off-duty cops. We brought in bloodhounds from the county, the best tracking dogs in the state. I figured the dogs would pick up the scent and lead us right to them. Maybe they'd gotten disoriented in the dark. Maybe the father had a heart attack or a stroke, and the family had panicked, trying to get him to help. Maybe the little girl had wandered off and they'd all gone looking for her. I ran through every scenario I could think of, but the dogs wouldn't track. I watched those hounds circle the campsite over and over again. Their hackles were raised and they were whining this low, anxious sound that made my skin crawl. They kept stopping at the tree line, refusing to go any further into the brush. The handler was baffled. He kept trying to get them to follow a scent, any scent, but they wouldn't do it. He told me he'd been working with tracking dogs for 15 years and he'd never seen anything like it. Those dogs were trained to track through swamps, through heavy brush, through snow, but it was like they sensed something out there that terrified them, something that overrode all their training. We spent days searching. We broke the forest into a grid pattern and walked every square foot we could cover. We looked under fallen logs. We checked ravines. We searched along the creek that ran about half a mile from the campsite. Nothing. No footprints. No torn clothing snagged on branches. No blood. No bodies. It was like they'd vanished into thin air. The longer we searched, the more frustrated I became. 4 people and a dog don't just disappear. There has to be a trail. There has to be something. The press got wind of it by day 3. Suddenly, I had reporters calling the station nonstop. Camera crews showed up at the trailhead. The families were doing interviews, begging for information. Mara's parents drove up from Idaho and set up a vigil at the trailhead with candles and photos of the kids. It was a media circus. The pressure from the higher-ups was intense. They wanted answers. They wanted results. But I had nothing to give them. I started looking at the people who knew the area, locals who spent a lot of time in the woods, hunters, trappers, drifters. There was one guy who kept coming up in conversations. His name was Russell Klein, but everyone called him Rook. He was a poacher and a generally unpleasant human being. Mid-50s. Lived off-grid in a shack about 8 miles from Iron Root Basin. No running water, no electricity, no neighbors for miles. He survived by trapping animals and selling their pelts illegally. He'd done time back in the 70s for aggravated assault. Beat a man half to death in a bar fight over something stupid. I brought him in for questioning. He came in voluntarily, which surprised me. Most guys like Rook lawyer up immediately. He smelled like wood smoke and old sweat. His clothes were filthy. His hands were calloused and scarred from years of working with traps and skinning knives. I sat him down in the interrogation room and asked him where he was on August 14th. He got real quiet, stared at the table for a long time. Then he started talking about the old man of the mountain. That's what the locals called it. Some kind of Bigfoot legend that had been around for decades. Stories about a huge hairy creature that lived in the deepest parts of the forest. People claimed to have seen it over the years, but there was never any proof. Just stories passed down from one generation to the next. Rook said he'd been in the woods that day checking his trap lines. He said he'd heard screaming coming from the direction of the campsite. He said it was a man's voice, deep and full of rage. Not fear, rage, like he was fighting something. Then it just stopped, cut off mid-scream. Rook claimed he ran. He said he saw something tall moving through the trees, but he couldn't make out what it was. He kept saying it was huge, bigger than any man, moving impossibly fast. I didn't buy it. I thought he was covering his ass, trying to deflect suspicion by pointing to some mythical creature. But we gave him a polygraph, and he passed. The examiner said Rook genuinely believed what he was saying. That didn't mean it was true. It just meant he wasn't consciously lying. Maybe he'd seen something, and his mind had filled in the blanks with the legend. Maybe he was so drunk or high that day that he didn't remember clearly. I had to let him go. We didn't have anything concrete. No physical evidence tying him to the disappearance. The case went cold. The family stayed missing. I worked other cases, but I never stopped thinking about them. Every few weeks, I'd drive back out to Iron Root Basin on my day off. I'd walk the site. I'd stare into those trees, trying to will the answer into existence, trying to figure out what I was missing. But nothing ever came to me. It was like the forest had swallowed them whole and refused to give them back. Then, in May of 1990, almost 9 months later, 2 hikers found them. They were college kids from Missoula on a spring break trip. They'd been hiking up on a ridge called the Throat, about 5 miles from the original campsite. It's not a place you'd stumble onto by accident. The terrain is brutal, near vertical in some spots, rocky and unstable. Most people avoid it. But these kids were experienced climbers looking for a challenge. They'd gotten off trail trying to find a better route when they saw the rocks. Someone had stacked heavy stones in front of a limestone fissure. A cave. The stones were big, some of them probably 50 or 60 pounds. They were arranged deliberately, not randomly. The kids thought it was strange. They moved a few of the rocks, and that's when they saw her. Mara Sterling was inside the cave with Caleb and Rose. They were huddled together in the back. The mother had her arms wrapped around both kids. The coroner said they died of exposure, hypothermia. It would have taken hours, maybe a full day. They would have been awake and aware the whole time, slowly getting colder and weaker until their bodies just gave out. I can't even imagine what that was like for them. The mother holding her kids, knowing there was no way out, knowing no one was coming. The cave entrance had been blocked deliberately. The rocks were too heavy for one person to move quickly. Whoever did this had time. They weren't in a hurry. They'd planned it. But Elias wasn't with them. We found him 100 yards down the slope. He was tied to a Douglas fir, not with rope, with vines and paracord woven together. The knots were complex, high-tension climbing knots, the kind you'd use for rappelling or securing heavy loads. Whoever tied him knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't some amateur job. His jaw was broken. Shattered, actually. The coroner couldn't say for sure if it happened before or after he died, but my gut told me it was after. Somebody had hit him in the face post-mortem. Maybe out of rage. Maybe just because they could. We found the family camera near his body, one of those disposable Kodak cameras you could buy at any drugstore. The film was still inside. I had it developed, hoping there might be something on there that would help us understand what happened. Most of the photos were normal. The kids playing, Caleb throwing rocks into the creek, Rose holding wildflowers, Mara smiling by the campfire, Elias cooking dinner, a happy family on vacation. The last photo was different. It was blurry. Just a gray streak of motion. It looked like something or someone moving incredibly fast toward the camera. At first I thought maybe the camera had been dropped or knocked over, but then I looked closer. I stared at that photo for hours. Eventually I noticed the texture. It wasn't fur. It was fabric, some kind of covering made from animal pelts stitched together, a ghillie suit. The kind hunters use to camouflage themselves. This wasn't a wild man or a cryptid. This was a person. A human being who dressed like a predator and hunted that family like they were game. That realization changed everything. I went back to the campsite with this new information. I started looking at everything differently. That's when I found the tree. It was about 50 yards from where the picnic table had been, just inside the tree line. The moss was rubbed off at eye level, around 7 feet high, not from an animal. Animals don't stand perfectly still in one spot for that long. Someone had been standing there, leaning against that tree, watching the family, watching them eat dinner, watching them laugh and talk, watching them put the kids to bed, just standing there perfectly still for hours. We recovered the cassette tape from the car, the one that had been in the player when the battery died. I hadn't thought much about it at the time, but now I wanted to hear what was on it. I had a tech enhance the audio. Under the static, we found something, a low, rhythmic thumping sound, like a drum or a heartbeat. It played over and over again, steady and deliberate. I think he was hitting a hollow log, driving them into a panic, creating a sound that would scare them, herding them like animals. He wanted them to run toward the ridge. He'd planned the whole thing. He wanted Elias to watch his wife and kids disappear into that cave. He wanted him to know they were dying, and there was nothing he could do about it. That's why he tied him to the tree separately, so he could watch, so he could suffer. We pulled a hair from the vines that had been wrapped around Elias. DNA technology back then wasn't what it is today. We were just starting to use it in criminal investigations. The lab said it was human, but there were anomalies in the sample. Probably contamination from being exposed to the elements for months. But that result fueled the Bigfoot rumors even more. People wanted to believe it was something supernatural because the alternative was too horrifying. The alternative was that a man had done this, a man who knew those woods better than anyone, a man who could move silently through the forest without leaving a trace, a man who could watch and wait and kill without remorse. The case is still open. We never caught him. The locals started calling him the Ridge Walker. There were a few more disappearances over the years in that general area, but nothing we could definitively link to him. A solo hiker in 1992, a young couple in 1995, all in remote areas, all without witnesses, all unsolved. I retired in 2020 after 34 years on the force. Mitch moved to Oregon a few years back, and we don't talk much anymore. I think the case affected him more than he'd like to admit. Sometimes I wonder if the Ridge Walker is still out there, if he's still hunting, if he ever thinks about the Sterling family the way I do. I don't camp anymore. I don't even like being in the woods. My wife wanted to go hiking last summer for our anniversary, and I made up an excuse. I couldn't do it. Every time I see a dense forest or hear the wind moving through the trees, I think about Mara and those kids huddled in that cave. I think about Elias, tied to that tree knowing he'd failed to protect them. I think about how close we came to never finding them at all. The thing that keeps me up at night isn't just that we didn't catch him. It's that he was so good at it. The precision, the planning, the patience, the control. This wasn't his first time. I'd bet my pension on that. You don't execute something that complex without practice. And I don't think it was his last. Somewhere out there in the forests of Montana, or maybe beyond, there's a man who knows how to make people disappear, who knows how to turn the wilderness into a trap, who gets off on the fear and the helplessness and the control. I still have the case file in my office at home. 3 boxes full of reports and photos and witness statements. Sometimes late at night, when I can't sleep, I pull it out and go through everything again. The photos, the autopsy reports, The evidence logs, the interview transcripts. I keep thinking maybe I missed something. Maybe there's a detail I overlooked that would crack it wide open. But I never find it. The Ridgewalker covered his tracks too well. He thought of everything. If you're reading this or listening to it or however the hell people consume stories these days, I want you to know something. The woods aren't as empty as you think they are. There are people out there who live completely off the grid, who know the trails and the ridges and the hidden places better than any park ranger or law enforcement officer ever could. Most of them are harmless. Hermits and survivalists who just want to be left alone. But some of them aren't. Some of them are dangerous. Some of them are waiting, watching, looking for the right opportunity. And if you're unlucky enough to cross their path at the wrong time, you might not make it back out. I think about Caleb and Rose a lot. They were just kids, 7 and 4 years old. They should have grown up and gone to college and gotten married and had kids of their own. They should have had full lives ahead of them. Instead, they died terrified and cold in a dark cave because some monster decided to hunt their family for sport. They didn't deserve what happened to them. None of them did. Elias and Mara were good people. They were just trying to give their kids a nice camping trip, a family adventure they'd remember for years to come. And someone took that away from them, turned it into a nightmare. I failed them. The whole system failed them. And that's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. I don't know why he did it. That's what bothers me the most. I don't know if he planned it weeks in advance, if he'd been watching them, following them, waiting for the right moment, or if he just happened to be in the woods that day and saw an opportunity and took it. I don't know if he feels remorse or if he's proud of what he did. I don't know if he kept trophies. I don't know if he's even still alive. But I know he was real, and I know he's out there somewhere. And until someone catches him, the Iron Root Basin will always be a place of unanswered questions and lingering fear. The Sterling family deserved better. They deserved justice. They deserve to be remembered as more than just victims in an unsolved case. And I hope to God that one day they'll get it. But I'm not holding my breath. Some cases don't get solved. Some monsters don't get caught. Some families never get closure. And sometimes the only thing you can do is remember. Remember their names. Remember their faces. Remember that they were real people with hopes and dreams and futures that were stolen from them. Elias Sterling, Mara Sterling, Caleb Sterling, Rose Sterling, and Buster, their golden retriever. They were real. They were loved. And they were taken by something evil that walks among us. I still drive past White Pine sometimes when I'm heading up to visit my daughter in Kalispell. I never stop. I can't. But I slow down as I pass through and I look toward those mountains, toward the Iron Root Basin, and I think about what's hidden up there, what secrets the forest is keeping, what other families might have crossed paths with the Ridgewalker over the years. How many other cases in other states might be connected? I wonder if anyone else has stumbled onto his path. If anyone else has felt that same creeping dread, that something is watching from the trees. If anyone else has heard that rhythmic thumping sound echoing through the darkness, drawing them deeper into the woods. I hope not. God, I hope not. But I know better. Predators don't stop until they're forced to stop, until they're caught or killed or too old to hunt anymore. And the Ridge Walker was good at what he did. Too good. He's probably still out there right now, watching, waiting, planning his next hunt, and there's nothing I can do about it except hope that someone somewhere makes a mistake, gets caught, gets stopped, before another family ends up like the Sterlings, before another detective spends the rest of his life haunted by the case he couldn't solve. That's my burden to carry. That's what keeps me awake at night 36 years later. The knowledge that I was so close and yet so far. That the answers were right there in front of me and I just couldn't see them. That 4 people and a dog died alone and terrified in those woods, and the person responsible is still free. Still out there, still hunting, and I couldn't stop him. That's what haunts me. That's what will haunt me until the day I die. The Montana forest disappearance that I couldn't solve. The case that broke me. The Sterling family. Story 3. I've been a detective for 22 years, and I've seen just about everything you can imagine in rural law enforcement. Meth labs hidden in barns, poachers who shoot at rangers, domestic disputes that turn into standoffs lasting hours. When you work the deep woods territory, you learn to expect the unexpected. You learn that people who choose to live that far from civilization often have their reasons, and those reasons aren't always good ones. But what happened in November of 2022 outside the small town of Blackwood Ridge still keeps me up at night. Not because of what I saw, but because of what I heard. Because of what was going through that man's mind when he pulled the trigger. The call came in at 4 a.m. on November 14th. I was already awake. Insomnia has been my companion for years now. So when my phone lit up on my nightstand, I answered on the first ring. Dispatch said we had a possible wild animal attack in progress on Forest Service Road 47, about 8 miles outside, Blackwood Ridge. The caller was barely coherent, screaming something about being shot and needing help immediately. I could hear him gasping for air between words. I threw on my clothes, grabbed my gear and my service weapon, and was out the door in under 5 minutes. My wife barely stirred. She's used to me leaving in the middle of the night. Blackwood Ridge is the kind of place most people drive through without stopping. Population around 800, maybe less depending on the season. It sits in the shadow of the Cascades, surrounded by dense timber that stretches for miles in every direction. The nearest real town is about 40 minutes away on winding mountain roads. People who live out there like it that way. They want the isolation, the quiet, the feeling of being disconnected from the rest of the world. But isolation cuts both ways. When something goes wrong out there, help is a long way off. I radioed for backup and an ambulance as I sped down the highway. The roads were slick with early morning frost, and a heavy mist had settled over everything, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Visibility was maybe 30 feet if you were lucky. The forest on either side of the road was pitch black. No lights, no houses, just trees. When I finally reached the turnoff for Forest Service Road 47, I could barely see it. I pulled in, slowly scanning the tree line with my spotlight. The road was unpaved, just gravel and dirt with deep ruts from logging trucks. That's when I saw him. He was crawling across the gravel, dragging his left arm behind him. His jacket was soaked through with blood, and he was making these awful gasping sounds, like he couldn't get enough air into his lungs. I jumped out of my vehicle and ran to him, identifying myself as law enforcement. The guy looked up at me, and his eyes were wild, absolutely terrified. He grabbed my jacket with his good hand, pulling me close, and that's when he said it. He tried to check my teeth. I didn't understand what he meant at the time. I focused on getting him stabilized and keeping pressure on the wound. His breathing was shallow and rapid. He was going into shock. The ambulance arrived maybe 10 minutes later, though it felt like an hour. As the paramedics loaded him up, I got a better look at the injury. It was a through-and-through gunshot wound high on the left shoulder. Clean entry and exit. high-caliber rifle from the look of it, maybe a .308 or .30-06. This wasn't a hunting accident. This wasn't someone taking a shot at a deer and hitting a person by mistake. The placement was too deliberate. And it definitely wasn't a wild animal. The victim's name was Marcus Graham, 28 years old, from Seattle. He was a land surveyor working a contract for the Forest Service. He'd driven out the night before, planning to get an early start on mapping some disputed boundary lines in the area. According to the paperwork in his truck, he was supposed to spend 3 days out there, alone, just him and his equipment. He'd set up camp about half a mile from where I found him. When I walked back to check his campsite, everything was still there. His tent was zipped shut. His gear was neatly organized. A pot of coffee sat cold on a portable stove. It looked like he'd left in the middle of making breakfast. I called in the shooting, and within an hour we had a perimeter set up. We were looking for an active shooter in dense timber with zero visibility and a heavy fog that wasn't lifting. The state police sent a tactical team, and we started a grid search working outward from where Graham had been found. We figured the shooter had to be close, maybe within a quarter mile. Most shooters panic after they fire. They run. They make mistakes. What we didn't know yet was that we weren't dealing with some panicked hunter or a random psycho with a grudge. We were dealing with someone who had been living in those woods for months. Someone who had been preparing. Someone who had been waiting. We found the nest around noon. It was about 200 yards uphill from the access road, tucked into a natural depression between two large Douglas firs and camouflaged so well that we almost walked right past it. One of the K9 units alerted on it. Whoever had built it knew exactly what they were doing. The hide was dug in about 3 feet deep, reinforced with logs and covered with brush moss and fallen branches. From above, it would have been completely invisible, even with thermal imaging. Inside, we found a sleeping bag rated for sub-zero temperatures, a small propane stove, canned food, and several gallon jugs of water. There was a tarp stretched overhead to keep out rain. But what caught my attention immediately was the notebook. It was a standard composition book, the kind you buy at any grocery store for $1. The cover was labeled in neat block letters, Infiltration Log, Day 41. I pulled on gloves and carefully opened it. The first entry was dated September 31st. That meant whoever had been out here had been living in the woods for over 6 weeks. The entries were detailed obsessively so. Times down to the minute. Locations marked with GPS coordinates, weather conditions, wind direction, temperature readings. But it was the actual content that made my blood run cold. The writer believed that something was systematically replacing the animals in the forest. He called them the hollows. According to his notes, they moved too smoothly for natural animals. They made no sound when they walked. Their eyes didn't reflect light properly when you shined a flashlight at them. He described watching a deer that walked wrong, with joints that bent at unnatural angles. He wrote about birds that held formation like drones, flying in perfect geometric patterns. At first I thought it was just paranoid schizophrenia, some guy who'd gone off his meds and spiraled into delusion. But as I kept reading, I realized it was more complex and more disturbing than that. The writer wasn't just observing. He was actively hunting. He had developed a complete system. He recorded movement patterns in excruciating detail. He documented behavioral anomalies. He had a whole section of the notebook dedicated to what he called tells, specific signs that would reveal the true nature of these creatures. He'd drawn diagrams. He'd created classification categories. And then about 2 weeks into the log, something changed. People started appearing in his entries. Hikers mostly, a few hunters. The writer cataloged them with the same obsessive detail he'd used for the animals. He noted their gait. He described how they reacted to sounds. He wrote about whether they looked around too much or not enough. He was convinced that the infiltration had moved beyond animals. The hollows were now wearing human faces, walking among us, pretending. I radioed back to command and requested a psychiatric profile specialist immediately. I also ran the serial number on the rifle we'd found in the hide. It came back registered to a man named Kenneth Bowen, age 45, last known address in Tacoma. I pulled up his file. Bowen was a former logistics contractor who'd worked for various government agencies, mostly in supply chain management. No criminal record, no history of violence. But according to his medical records, he'd been hospitalized twice in the past 3 years for acute paranoid episodes. The last time was in June, just 5 months earlier. He'd been released after a 2-week psychiatric hold with a prescription for antipsychotics that he'd apparently never filled. His family had reported him missing in early October. They said he'd become increasingly withdrawn, convinced that something was wrong with the world. He'd stopped showing up for work, stopped answering his phone. And then one day he just disappeared. We now had a name and a profile. Bowen wasn't just dangerous. He was organized, methodical, and operating under a complex, delusional system that made perfect sense to him. The tactical team shifted strategy immediately. This wasn't going to be a quick takedown. We were tracking someone who believed he was in a war, someone who thought he was the only one who could see the truth, someone who had nothing to lose. The search went on for 3 days. Bowen knew counter-tracking techniques, probably learned them during his time working with government contractors. He avoided trails completely. He moved only through the densest cover where visibility was near zero. He left almost no physical sign, no broken branches, no footprints in the soft earth, no disturbed ground cover. But he made one critical mistake. He stayed in the area. Most fugitives run. They put as much distance as possible between themselves and the scene. They want to disappear. Bowen didn't because in his mind he wasn't fleeing. He was defending a position. He was holding the line against an invasion that only he could see. On the 3rd day, we finally got a break. One of the tracking dogs picked up a scent near a ravine about a mile west of the original hide. We moved in carefully, weapons drawn, spread out in a tactical formation. The ravine was steep and choked with underbrush. At the bottom, maybe 40 feet down, we could hear running water. A small creek, and then we heard him. He was talking to himself, not mumbling the way mentally ill people sometimes do when they're off their medication. Actually talking. Full sentences delivered in a calm, measured tone like he was giving a briefing to subordinates. I signaled the team to hold position, and we all stopped to listen. He was reciting GPS coordinates, describing movement patterns. He mentioned the surveyor and how the mimicry is improving at an exponential rate. He said the creature had looked completely human even up close, that it had grown teeth specifically to fool him, that the adaptation was happening faster than his models had predicted. That's when I understood what had actually happened to Marcus Graham. Bowen hadn't shot him from a distance. In a moment of panic, he'd stalked him for hours, maybe even since the night before. He'd watched Graham set up camp. He'd watched him make coffee. He'd watched him gather his surveying equipment. He'd been conducting an observation, waiting to confirm his suspicions, and when Graham crouched down to tie his boot, Bowen had interpreted that simple human movement as a predator shifting into attack posture. He'd fired, believing he was stopping an imminent assault, believing he was saving his own life. And then when Graham went down, Bowen had done something that still makes my skin crawl even now, years later. He'd run down to the body. He'd approached carefully, keeping his rifle trained on the fallen man. And he'd tried to pry open Graham's mouth to inspect his teeth. In Bowen's mythology, the hollows had perfectly flat teeth like herbivores. Human canines, those sharp-pointed teeth designed for tearing meat, were supposed to be the giveaway, the one thing they couldn't fake. But when Bowen saw that Graham had completely normal human teeth, he didn't feel relief. He didn't realize he'd made a terrible mistake. Instead, he felt suspicion. He wrote in his journal later that night that the adaptation is accelerating beyond predicted parameters. We moved in on Bowen's position slowly and deliberately. The ravine narrowed as we descended, and visibility dropped to almost nothing. The underbrush was so thick we had to push through it physically. When we finally spotted him, he was crouched behind a fallen log rifle, laid across his knees, staring directly at us. He'd known we were coming. He'd heard us. For a long moment, nobody moved. We all just stood there in this frozen tableau. Then Bowen stood up slowly. He didn't raise the rifle. He didn't make any aggressive moves. He just stood there looking at each of us in turn, studying our faces. "Show me your eyes," he said. His voice was steady, almost polite. Not threatening, just requesting. "Hold still and show me your eyes. They don't reflect light properly if you're human." One of the officers, a young guy named Allen, tried to talk him down. He used all the standard negotiation techniques, spoke in a calm voice, called Bowen by his first name, told him we were there to help him. But Bowen wasn't listening. He took a step forward, still holding the rifle, though it remained pointed at the ground. "You're getting better at the voices," he said, looking directly at Allen. "The vocal patterns are nearly perfect now, but I can still tell. You move wrong, all of you. Your movements are too smooth, too coordinated. Real humans don't move like that." That's when the team leader gave the order. We deployed flashbangs, those non-lethal grenades that produce a blinding flash and a deafening bang designed to disorient suspects. The K-9 unit went in immediately after. Bowen went down hard, hitting the ground face first. Even as we were cuffing him, putting his hands behind his back, he was trying to bite the officers. Not to hurt them, that became clear later, but to taste the blood. He was still trying to verify. He kept shouting that the hollows had synthetic blood that tasted like metal. That if he could just taste our blood, he could prove what we really were. The interrogation took place 2 days later after Bowen had been evaluated by a psychiatric team. I sat across from him in a small, windowless room at the county jail. He was calm, disturbingly calm. The kind of calm that comes from absolute certainty. He looked at me not with hostility, but with something almost like pity. Like I was a student who hadn't quite grasped an obvious concept, and he was about to patiently explain it one more time. "You don't see it yet," he said, leaning forward slightly. "But you will. Eventually everyone will." The infiltration started small. Just a few animals at first, testing the waters, then isolated people, hikers, campers. People no one would miss right away. They're taken and replaced, and then they go back to town, and the infection spreads exponentially. I asked him about Marcus Graham. Bowen nodded slowly. "The surveyor," he said. "I watched him for 3 hours and 42 minutes. I had to be absolutely certain. I couldn't afford a mistake. He set up that tripod, and the way it unfolded, it looked like limbs, like something mechanical pretending to be a tool. The movements were too precise, too deliberate, and then he crouched down. That's the attack posture. They always crouch before they spring. It's instinctive for them." I asked him why he'd tried to check Graham's teeth. Bowen leaned even closer. Because that's the primary tell, he said with the kind of earnest intensity you'd expect from a scientist explaining a breakthrough discovery. They can copy everything else. The face, the voice, the mannerisms, the way we move. But they struggle with teeth. The biological structure is too complex, except now they can. The one I shot had perfectly formed human teeth, canines incisors, molars, all of it. Perfect. That means they're adapting faster than I thought. That means they're learning from each encounter. He paused, then said something that I'll never forget as long as I live. I have to adjust my tactics for future encounters. Next time I'll go for an immediate headshot. That way, the biological mimicry doesn't have time to adapt before I can conduct a proper post-encounter examination and confirm the kill. Bowen never went to trial. The psychiatric evaluation was unambiguous. He was declared legally incompetent and committed to a state psychiatric facility indefinitely. Marcus Graham survived the shooting, but he's got permanent nerve damage in his left arm and limited mobility in his shoulder. He doesn't do field work anymore. Last I heard, he'd moved back to Seattle, taken a desk job with the city, and refuses to talk about what happened. He won't even go camping with his friends anymore. I still think about that case more than I'd like to admit, way more than I should. Not because of the violence I've seen worse in my years on the force, but because of how rational Bowen sounded when he explained his reasoning. Inside his delusion, everything made perfect logical sense. He had rules. He had evidence that confirmed his beliefs. He had a clear mission that he believed was righteous. To him, he wasn't a criminal. He wasn't a dangerous lunatic. He was the last line of defense against something catastrophic that no one else could see. He was the only one paying attention, the only one willing to act. The part that bothers me the most, the part that keeps me awake at night, is this. Bowen is still out there in that facility, still writing in his notebooks, still cataloging behavior patterns through the limited observations he can make, still developing his theories, still convinced that the rest of us just haven't figured it out yet, that we're all blind to the truth. And every single time I go into the woods now, which I have to do regularly for my job, I can't help but wonder if someone out there is watching me right now, studying my movements, analyzing my gait, waiting to see if I move wrong, waiting for me to crouch at the wrong moment, waiting to make that final determination about whether I'm still human or if I've already been replaced. And honestly, I'm not sure which possibility scares me more. Story 4. I still think about that night in the Oregon wilderness, and honestly, I don't know if I'll ever stop. This happened back in late December of 1998. I was 24 at the time, working as a junior ranger for the State Forestry Service. It wasn't glamorous work, mostly trail maintenance and visitor education, but I loved being outdoors, and the pay was decent enough. That winter had been brutal. We'd gotten more snow than usual, and a lot of the backcountry trails were impassable, which meant fewer hikers and a lot more quiet time in the ranger station. My supervisor, Keith Anderson, had asked me to do a solo supply run to one of the remote cabins we maintained for emergency shelter. The cabin was about 12 miles into the Whitewood Valley backcountry, near a place locals called Pinehurst Gorge. It wasn't an official town, just a cluster of maybe 30 houses and a general store that serviced the logging families who'd lived there for generations. Keith said the cabin hadn't been checked since October, and with New Year's approaching, we needed to make sure the firewood was stocked and the emergency radio was functional. I remember being annoyed about the timing. Most of my co-workers had already left for the holidays, and I'd been looking forward to a quiet week off. I loaded up my truck with supplies, canned food, batteries, medical kit, firewood, and fresh propane tanks. The drive out to the trailhead took about 2 hours through winding mountain roads. The snow had let up, but everything was covered in this thick white blanket that made the forest look almost unreal. I parked at the access point around 2 p.m., figuring I'd reach the cabin by 5 p.m., do a quick inspection, and hike back out by headlamp if necessary. The trail was harder than I expected. The snowpack was deep and every step required effort. My pack felt heavier with each mile and the temperature was dropping fast. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already starting to set behind the ridgeline, casting long shadows through the Douglas firs. The cabin looked exactly how I remembered it. A small A-frame structure with a covered porch and shuttered windows. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. Everything seemed fine. The interior was cold but dry. I got to work immediately unloading supplies, stacking firewood, and testing the radio. That's when I noticed something odd. On the small wooden table in the center of the room, there was a coil of rope. Not the standard nylon rope we kept in our emergency kits. This was old hemp rope, braided in a way I'd never seen before. It was tied in this elaborate knot that looked almost decorative, like something you'd see in a maritime museum. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. The rope was weathered, but not ancient. Someone had been in this cabin recently. I checked the logbook we kept by the door. The last entry was from September, written by Keith himself. No one had signed in since. I felt my stomach tighten. We were supposed to be the only people with keys to these cabins. I told myself it was probably just another ranger who forgot to log their visit, but something about that rope bothered me. The knot was too intricate, too deliberate. I set it back down on the table and finished my work, trying not to think about it. By the time I was done, it was nearly 6 p.m. and fully dark outside. I should have stayed the night. That was the smart thing to do. But I wanted to get out of there. I couldn't explain it, but that rope had unsettled me in a way I couldn't shake. I packed up my gear, locked the cabin, and started back down the trail. The hike out was miserable. My headlamp cut through the darkness in this narrow beam, and every sound seemed amplified. Branches creaking, wind howling, snow falling from trees in heavy clumps. I kept my pace steady, trying to cover ground quickly. About halfway back, I heard something that made me stop dead in my tracks. Footsteps. Not mine, these were behind me. I turned around, shining my light back up the trail, but I couldn't see anything beyond maybe 20 feet. The sound stopped. I waited, holding my breath, listening. Nothing. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or elk, moving through the brush. I kept walking, but faster now. The footsteps started again. This time they were closer, and they matched my rhythm exactly. When I walked, they walked. When I stopped, they stopped. My heart started pounding, and I felt this cold sweat break out across my back despite the freezing temperature. I spun around again, sweeping my headlamp across the trees. That's when I saw it. Just at the edge of my light, there was a figure standing perfectly still between two massive pines. I couldn't make out details, just a dark shape that was distinctly human. I shouted, asking who was there, trying to keep my voice steady. No response. The figure didn't move. I felt my hand instinctively go to the knife on my belt. I'm not a confrontational person, but I wasn't about to let someone stalk me through the woods without identifying themselves. I started walking toward the figure, keeping my light trained on it. As I got closer, maybe 30 feet away, the figure suddenly darted sideways, disappearing behind a tree. I broke into a jog, my pack bouncing against my back. When I reached the spot where I'd seen them, there was nothing. No footprints in the snow, no broken branches, nothing. That's impossible, I thought. The snow was deep. Anyone moving that fast would leave obvious tracks. I scanned the area with my light, my breath coming in sharp gasps. Then I saw them. Footprints, but not leading away from where the figure had been. These prints led toward the trail ahead of me, like whoever it was had circled around. I didn't think. I just started running. I didn't care about pacing or conserving energy. I just needed to get out of those woods. The footsteps behind me started again, but this time they were running too. I could hear branches snapping and snow crunching, and it sounded like more than one person. My lungs burned from the cold air, and my legs felt like they were on fire, but I didn't stop. I rounded a bend in the trail, and that's when I saw it. Another figure standing directly in my path, maybe 50 feet ahead. This one wasn't hiding. They were just standing there, arms at their sides, waiting. I skidded to a stop, nearly losing my balance. My light illuminated the figure enough for me to see details. They were wearing dark clothing, a heavy coat and pants that looked decades old. Their face was partially obscured by a hood, but I could see enough to tell it was a man. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with deeply lined features and this expression that I can only describe as calm. Too calm. He didn't move as I stood there gasping for air. Then he raised one hand slowly and pointed off the trail into the forest to my left. I didn't understand what he was trying to tell me, and I didn't care. I veered right, crashing through the underbrush off the main trail. The terrain was brutal. I was stumbling over hidden roots and rocks, my pack catching on branches. I could still hear movement behind me, but I couldn't tell how close they were. My headlamp flickered once, then died completely. I cursed, fumbling in my pocket for my backup flashlight. When I finally got it on and looked up, I realized I had no idea where I was. I'd gone off trail in a full panic, and now I was completely disoriented. The smart thing would have been to stop and think, but I was too terrified. I kept moving forward, hoping I'd hit the main trail, or at least recognize some landmark. Then I saw light. Not my light. This was a faint orange glow coming from somewhere ahead through the trees. I moved toward it cautiously. As I got closer, I realized it was a campfire. There was a small clearing, and someone had set up camp. I approached, slowly calling out that I was a ranger and needed help. A woman stepped into view. She looked to be in her 40s, bundled in a thick parka with her hair pulled back in a braid. She seemed startled to see me, but not afraid. I must have looked like a lunatic stumbling out of the woods covered in snow and gasping for breath. I told her someone was following me, that I needed to get out of the area immediately. She didn't ask questions. She just nodded and said her truck was parked about a mile away at an old logging road access point. She'd been camping illegally, she admitted, but she'd leave with me if I was in trouble. We packed up her gear as quickly as possible and started moving. She had a better sense of direction than I did, and she led us through the forest with confidence. I kept looking back, expecting to see those figures emerge from the darkness, but nothing came. We reached her truck around 9 p.m. I'd never been so relieved to see a vehicle in my life. She drove me back to the main trailhead where my truck was still parked. I thanked her, probably a dozen times, and she just waved it off, saying she understood what it was like to feel unsafe in the woods. I drove straight to the ranger station and called Keith. I told him everything, the rope, the figures, the chase. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, there was this long pause. Then he told me something that made my blood run cold. Back in the late 80s, there had been a series of disappearances in that area. 4 people over the course of 2 years. All of them were researchers or forestry workers who'd been found dead with braided ropes tied around their necks in elaborate knots. The case had gone cold decades ago, but every few years someone would report seeing figures in the woods near Pinehurst Gorge. Keith said most rangers dismissed it as legend or paranoia, but he'd always wondered. He told me to file an official report and that he'd contact the county sheriff. The sheriff's department sent someone out the next day. They searched the cabin and found the rope exactly where I'd left it. They sent it to a lab for analysis, but nothing came back. No fingerprints, no DNA, just old hemp rope that could have been made any time in the last 50 years. They searched the trails, but the snow had covered any tracks. Officially, they classified it as a possible encounter with squatters or vagrant campers. Unofficially, the deputy told me I was lucky. He said people still went missing in those woods, and that whatever I'd run into, I'd been smart to run. I quit the Forestry Service 3 months later. I told people it was because I'd gotten a better job offer in Portland, but that wasn't true. I just couldn't go back into those woods. I still think about that night all the time. Who were those people? Why were they following me? And that rope? Why leave it in the cabin like some kind of calling card? The woman who helped me gave me her number, and we stayed in touch for a while. She told me she'd done some research and found old newspaper articles about the murders from 1987 and 1988. The victims had all been found in the same general area near Pinehurst Gorge. The killer was never caught. I don't know if what I encountered was connected to those old cases. Maybe it was just random. Maybe I stumbled into something I wasn't supposed to see. But sometimes late at night, I think about that man standing on the trail pointing into the forest. Was he trying to warn me, or was he directing someone else? I'll never know. What I do know is that there's something in those woods, something that doesn't want to be found, and I'm never going back to find out what it is. Story 5. I still think about that case almost every single day. It's been over 20 years now, but certain things just don't leave you. I can't drive past a semi-truck on the interstate without my stomach twisting into knots. Can't look at rest stop parking lots the same way either. This all happened between 1998 and 2004 when I was working as a detective sergeant with the Washington State Police Homicide Division out of Spokane. I was younger then, maybe too confident, thought I could solve anything if I just worked hard enough. This case taught me otherwise. What I'm about to tell you isn't something I usually talk about. Most people don't want to hear the ugly truth about the ones that nearly got away or the mistakes we made along the way. It started on a cold February morning in 1998. I got the call around 6 a.m., still dark outside, the kind of morning where you can see your breath in the air, even inside your house because the heat hasn't kicked in yet. A hiker had found a body in a ravine just outside this tiny logging town called Deer Ridge, Washington. Population maybe 800 people on a good day. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone and nothing bad is supposed to happen. By the time I got there, the sun was just starting to come up over the Cascade foothills, and the whole scene had this eerie quiet to it. The victim was a young woman, early 20s, strangled and left in the ravine like she was nothing. No ID on her. No one reported her missing. Just another Jane Doe. What caught my attention right away, what really stuck with me, were the knots used on the ligature around her neck. They weren't your typical panic knots or the messy, improvised work of someone who didn't know what they were doing. These were clean, methodical, professional even. The kind of knots you'd see on a cargo strap or maybe something a long-haul trucker would use to secure a load. I remember crouching down next to the body, taking photographs with my camera and thinking this person knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was calculated. I made a detailed note of it in my report and even mentioned it to the other detectives on scene, but honestly, at the time, I don't think anyone took it as seriously as they should have. We had 2 suspects in custody within a week. A local couple, both heavy into meth, with a rap sheet full of petty theft and domestic disturbances. They confessed almost immediately. The woman broke down crying during interrogation, saying she couldn't live with the guilt anymore. The district attorney was thrilled. A quick arrest, a quick confession, a quick conviction. It made everyone look good. The department, the DA's office, the mayor. Case closed. But something about their confession bothered me deep down in my gut. They knew details about the crime scene, sure, but those exact details had already been leaked to the local press by someone in our own department. I'd seen it happen before. Desperate people, confessing to crimes they didn't commit just to get attention or to leverage a plea deal on other charges. When I pressed them specifically about the knots, about the technique, they couldn't give me a straight answer. The woman just kept repeating that she tied it real tight, and the man sat there nodding along like a puppet. It didn't sit right with me. I brought my concerns to my lieutenant, laid out everything I'd observed, showed him my notes and photographs. He shut me down hard. Told me the case was closed. Told me to stop wasting everyone's time. Told me we had a confession, and that was good enough. The couple went to prison. I was told in no uncertain terms to move on to the next case. I tried. God knows I tried. I had other cases, other victims who needed justice, but it gnawed at me. Then, in October of 1999, about a year and a half later, another body turned up. This time, it was in a rest stop bathroom near the Oregon border, just south of a tiny town called Pinewood, Washington. Another young woman. Another strangulation. Same ligature marks, same precise, professional knots. I knew the second I saw the crime scene photos. I knew immediately it was the same killer. My hands were shaking as I held those photos. We'd put the wrong people in prison, and the real killer had kept going. I went straight to my superiors. I laid out the evidence, showed them the similarities, begged them to reopen the investigation. They refused. They'd already gotten convictions. They'd already held press conferences announcing they'd solved the case. Admitting we got it wrong, admitting an innocent couple was rotting in prison while a killer walked free, that would have been a political nightmare. No one wanted to touch it. So I made a decision that probably should have gotten me fired. I started working the case on my own time, off the books, using my own gas money to drive around to different crime scenes, making phone calls from my home phone so it wouldn't show up on department records. My wife, Linda, hated it. She said I was becoming obsessed, said I wasn't sleeping, said I was bringing darkness into our home. She wasn't wrong. I'd come home at midnight after working a double, and then spend another 3 hours going through case files at the kitchen table. She'd find me asleep with my head on a stack of folders. Maybe I was obsessed, but I couldn't let it go. Someone had to care about these women, these Jane Does who nobody reported missing, nobody came looking for. That's when the packages started arriving at my house. The first one showed up on a Tuesday evening in November of 1999. I remember the date because it was my daughter's birthday, and I'd promised Linda I'd be home early. I pulled into the driveway around 7 p.m., later than I said I'd be, but earlier than usual, and there it was sitting on my front porch. A brown paper package, no return address, just my name and address written in neat block letters. I should have called it in immediately. I should have treated it as evidence. But curiosity got the better of me. I brought it inside, waited until Linda took our daughter upstairs to bed. Then I opened it at the kitchen table. Inside was a folded road map, the kind you used to get at gas stations before everyone had GPS, showing Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. Marked in red ink were routes crisscrossing all 3 states: I-90, I-5, Highway 2, Highway 97, all the major trucking corridors. Pinned to the map with actual pushpins were Polaroid photographs. My blood ran cold when I looked at them. They were pictures of women, all of them clearly dead but posed to look like they were sleeping. Each one was propped up in the passenger seat of a semi-truck cab, looking out the window at landmarks I recognized instantly. Mount Rainier in the background of one, the Columbia River Gorge in another, Snoqualmie Pass, Spokane Falls, places I'd driven past hundreds of times. On the back of a creased fuel receipt taped to the bottom of the map was a handwritten message, same block letters. You jailed the sinners, but I am the one doing the Lord's work. Why do you let liars steal my glory, detective? I read it 3 times. My hands were shaking so bad I nearly dropped it. This wasn't just a killer. This was someone who believed they were righteous, someone who thought they were doing something holy. And they knew who I was. They knew where I lived. They'd been watching me. I took the package to my lieutenant first thing the next morning, walked right into his office before he'd even had his coffee. He told me to file a report, said he'd forward it to the FBI, said they'd handle it. I waited 2 weeks. Nothing happened. I called the FBI field office myself. They said they'd received the report, but they had bigger cases, more pressing matters, budget constraints. They'd get to it eventually. Eventually wasn't good enough for me. I started digging on my own. I pulled every single Jane Doe case from the past, 5 years across Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. Every unsolved murder, every unidentified body. I'm talking dozens of cases. I spread them all out on my dining room table, covered the whole surface with crime scene photos and reports. Linda stopped eating dinner with me. Said she couldn't look at it anymore. I was looking for patterns, for anything that connected these women. What I found kept me up at night. At least 9 women, ranging in age from 19 to 35, all of them found near highways or rest stops or truck scales. All of them strangled. All of them showing those same precise knots. But here's what was driving me crazy. There were no crime scenes. No physical evidence left behind besides the bodies themselves. No DNA, no fibers, no witnesses. It was like this person was a ghost, just vanishing into thin air after each kill. That's when it clicked for me. What if the crime scene wasn't stationary? What if it was moving? What if this killer lived on the road? I started looking into trucking companies. This was 1999, 2000 by this point, and companies were just starting to use fuel card technology to track their drivers. A lot of them weren't keeping great records yet. Everything was still kind of scattered and disorganized, but I was persistent. I called every major trucking company that operated in the Pacific Northwest. I explained I was investigating a series of crimes and I needed to cross-reference their fuel card data with specific dates and locations. Most of them hung up on me. Some threatened to call my superiors. A few actually cooperated. After months of this, after countless dead ends and sleepless nights, I finally found something. There was a truck registered to a mid-sized company called Northern Freight Lines out of Tacoma. This particular truck kept vanishing from their GPS and fuel card logs for weird windows of time. 4 hours here, 6 hours there. Always on routes that passed near where bodies had been found. Always. During time frames that matched up with estimated times of death. The gaps were just long enough for someone to pick up a victim, kill them, dump the body, and clean out the cab. The truck was registered to a driver named Gary Calhoun. I pulled everything I could find on him. DMV records showed a massive guy, 6'7", 280 pounds. He'd been driving long-haul routes for Northern Freight for almost 15 years. Clean record, not even a speeding ticket. I called his dispatcher, pretended I was doing a routine employment verification. She said Gary was one of their best drivers. Reliable, professional, never late, never caused problems. She said other drivers called him a gentle giant. Said he was quiet and kept to himself, but was always willing to help someone with a flat tire or a mechanical issue. On paper, this guy looked like the least likely suspect you could imagine. Model employee, model citizen. But I'd been doing this job long enough to know that the worst ones, the really dangerous ones, they don't look like monsters. They look normal. They blend in. They're the person you'd trust to help you change a tire on the side of the road. I tried to get a warrant to search his truck. I presented everything I had to a judge. The fuel card data, the timeline, the patterns. The judge said it was all circumstantial, that I didn't have probable cause. My lieutenant said I was chasing ghosts and wasting department resources. He threatened to write me up if I didn't drop it. I was running out of options, and I knew Gary Calhoun was still out there, still driving, still hunting. That's when I decided to do something risky, something that could have backfired spectacularly. I leaked a story to a local news reporter, someone I'd worked with before on other cases. I told them we had a copycat killer trying to take credit for murders that had already been solved. I specifically called the killer a coward, said they were just trying to steal the infamy of the couple we'd already put in prison. I said the real killers were already behind bars, and this new guy was just a wannabe. I knew if Gary Calhoun was a narcissist, if he had an ego about his work, this would bruise it. I was betting everything on him reacting. It worked. A week later, early morning in March of 2004, another package arrived at my house. This one was smaller, just a manila envelope. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph. The image made my stomach drop. It was a woman, alive this time, her eyes wide with terror, duct tape over her mouth, sitting in the passenger seat of a truck cab. You could see the fear in her eyes even through the photograph. On the back, written in those same block letters, "I am not a copycat. I am the saint. Watch the news, detective. I will prove it to you." I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with every map I owned spread out in front of me, trying to figure out where he'd go, what he'd do, how I could stop him before he killed again. Linda came downstairs around 3 a.m. and found me sitting there in the dark. She didn't say anything, just put her hand on my shoulder and went back to bed. She knew there was no talking me down at that point. Then it hit me around 4 a.m. The couple we'd wrongfully convicted, they'd been tried and sentenced in a tiny courthouse in a town called Riverside, Washington, about 2 hours east of Spokane. If Gary wanted to prove he was the real killer, if he wanted to prove his superiority and humiliate me at the same time, that's where he'd go. He'd dump the body somewhere symbolic. Courthouse steps, police station, somewhere that would make his point impossible to ignore. I started making phone calls. I called every officer I'd ever worked with that I trusted, explained the situation, told them I needed their help. My lieutenant found out what I was doing and tried to shut it down, said I was going to destroy my career over a hunch. I told him I didn't care. A woman's life was on the line. We set up at the way stations leading into Riverside. If Gary was driving his commercial rig, and I was betting he was because that's where he felt safe, he'd have to go through one of them. We waited in our vehicles, engines off, radios on low. It was pouring rain that night, the kind of heavy Pacific Northwest rain that turns everything into a blur, makes it hard to see more than a few feet in front of you. Hours passed. I was starting to think I'd gotten it wrong, that maybe he'd outsmarted me, gone somewhere else entirely. Then, around 9 p.m., a call came over the radio. A trucker matching Gary Calhoun's description and driving a Northern Freight Lines rig had just pulled into the way station on Highway 2. We moved fast, boxing his truck in with our patrol cars so he couldn't back out or drive forward. I approached the cab with my weapon drawn and my heart pounding so hard in my chest I thought I might pass out. I could see him through the rain-streaked windshield, this massive silhouette of a man hunched over the steering wheel, completely still. I yelled for him to step out of the vehicle, announced myself as police. He didn't move, didn't even turn his head, just sat there like a statue. That's when I noticed the CB radio in his hand. I ran back to one of our patrol cars, grabbed the CB radio, switched to the channel truckers typically used. I called out to him. His voice came through the speaker, deep and eerily calm. "Detective," he said, "I knew you'd figure it out eventually. You're smarter than the rest of them. That's why I chose you." I asked him to let the woman go, told him it didn't have to end this way. There was a long pause, just the sound of rain hitting metal and the static of the radio. Then he laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh or a mocking laugh. It was sadder than that, almost disappointed. "You don't understand," he said. His voice cracked slightly. "I'm trying to save her, detective. This world is so unbelievably cruel. She's been through so much pain already. I can see it in her eyes. I can end it for her. I can give her peace. That's what I do. I'm not a monster, I'm a saint." I felt physically sick hearing him say it. He genuinely believed it. This wasn't someone acting evil or trying to be scary. This was someone who was completely convinced in his own mind that he was helping these women, that he was performing some kind of mercy. That made him so much more dangerous. I had to think fast. I had to play into his delusion if I wanted any chance of getting that woman out alive. I took a breath, steadied my voice, pressed the radio button. "Gary," I said, using his first name deliberately, "I understand. I know the world is cruel. I see it every day in this job. Maybe you're right. Maybe you are trying to help." I paused, chose my next words carefully. "But if you're truly a saint, if you're truly merciful, then show me mercy too. Let me see her. Let me know she's at peace. Let me understand what you understand." There was a long silence. Rain kept falling. I could see other officers tense behind their vehicles, hands on their weapons, waiting. Then I heard it. The click of the truck's door locks opening. I signaled for everyone to hold position, and I slowly walked to the passenger side of the cab. I opened the door. The woman was in the sleeper compartment behind the driver's seat, hands bound, tape over her mouth, but alive. Her eyes met mine, and I saw recognition, hope. I helped her out of the truck while other officers moved in on Gary. He didn't resist. He just sat there with his hands on the steering wheel, tears running down his face, repeating the same thing over and over. I was saving her. Why can't you see that? I was just trying to save her. Paramedics got her stabilized and rushed her to the hospital. She survived. Broken ribs, bruises, trauma that would take years to process, but alive. Gary Calhoun confessed to 9 murders officially, but during interrogations he hinted at more, way more. The FBI eventually estimated he might have killed 40 or more women over the years as he crisscrossed the country. The couple we'd wrongfully imprisoned was released immediately, but their lives were already destroyed. The woman died of a drug overdose less than 2 years after getting out. The man's still in and out of halfway houses and treatment facilities. Their blood is on our hands just as much as it's on Gary's. I retired early, took my pension at 53 and moved to a small cabin outside of Spokane. up in the mountains away from the highways. I can't drive on the interstate anymore without looking at every single semi-truck that passes, wondering who's behind the wheel, wondering if there are more like Gary out there hiding in plain sight. My wife says I need to let it go, says it's eating me alive. She's probably right, but I don't know how. What haunts me most, what keeps me awake at night even now, isn't the bodies or even the individual victims, though God knows I think about them. It's knowing that for 5 full years we had the wrong people locked up and the real killer kept going. How many women would still be alive if I'd pushed harder in 1998? If I had refused to back down when my lieutenant told me to drop it? How many times did I drive past Gary Calhoun's truck on the highway, not knowing what was inside, not knowing there might have been someone in there who needed help? I'll never have those answers. Some nights I still wake up thinking about it, replaying everything in my head, wondering what I could have done differently. You can close a case, write the final report, put someone in prison, but you can't close your mind. You can't stop the questions. You can't unhear the things they say when they truly believe they're righteous. That's the part they don't tell you about this job when you sign up. That's the part that follows you home and never leaves.